I haven't spoken about it before, although some of the materials I'm going to use I've spoken about before. Revenge. Is revenge a Jewish idea? Should we be looking forward to revenge against the obscenely animalistic, brutal atrocities that were committed? Now, as I often do, I'll get to the Jewish view, or some part of the Jewish view, a little bit later. But I want to set the stage because people have been programmed, brainwashed. Revenge? That's uncivilized. Revenge is just your emotions. Revenge is childish. He hit me, so I'm going to get him back. And so it's just off the stage. And to someone who wants to speak in favor of revenge, people will just leave and say, you're primitive. We're not talking to you. That's a good way to protect yourself from thinking, if thinking is too painful. So I want to just talk about a little bit about the philosophical background, part of the philosophical background. So as to sort of loosen up those prejudices, loosen up that programming and that brainwashing. Punishment is discussed in two ways in philosophical literature or the literature of intellectuals who are thinking about the subject. One is what's called utilitarian. Punishment should serve a good purpose. Punishment should accomplish a good end, like protecting yourself from the criminal who may victimize other people, like deterring other criminals who would be tempted to commit crimes, but who see the punishment and are afraid. When the punishment, and also sometimes the rehabilitation of the criminal. So those are good ends that the punishment serves, and that being the case, there's a case to be made for instituting punishment. But the thought is, that's because although punishment hurts and deprives the criminal, it serves a very good purpose. The other type of discussion is called retributive punishment, retribution. You did something, and it's right that these should be the consequences of what you did. And if you committed a crime, especially if you victimized someone, it is right that you should suffer for doing that. The very suffering itself is right. The very suffering itself is just. The very suffering itself is a morally positive thing to happen, even if it doesn't create any future good consequences whatsoever. Now, that position is subject to the childish critique I mentioned 2 minutes ago. It's childish, it's emotional, it's uncivilized, it's not doing any good. It's not doing any good. So, then it can't be appropriate morally. So it's not doing any good. Put in those terms, this discussion fits into a giant industry in ethics of two different attitudes towards responsibilities. One is called consequentialist, where what you are responsible to do is dictated by the consequences of what you do, and only by the consequences of what you do. The only relevant consideration is what kinds of consequences does it have. That's a utilitarian position. You discover what's good, what's better, what's positive, what's worth investing in, and you ask, when you acted, did you pick the option which would have the consequences which most produce those kinds of consequences? That's consequentialism. Just ask, first decide what makes the world a good place, what makes the world a better place, and when you're choosing an action, choose the action that has the biggest impact in making the world a better place. And that's the only consideration. Others which are called in the literature of deontologists, say at least there are some rules for action which aren't dependent upon consequences. Not only are they not dependent upon consequences, but they might override the consequences. And so then you'll have a mixed picture. Yes, consequences are important. No one denies that. When you seek to perform an action, one thing you should check as best you can is what kind of consequences it will have, whether it will influence consequences which are themselves good or not, or ones that are bad. But in addition to that, there are rules which are independent of consequences and which are sometimes strong enough to overpower the consequences. If you take the latter position, which in my view is the only sane position, and I'll give you some arguments for it, then you've opened a window. Well, maybe in punishment, it's not right to only consider whether punishing him will have good consequences, like deterring other criminals, like protecting this world from this criminal, like rehabilitating the criminal. Maybe that's not the only consideration. Maybe there are other considerations. And then we'll talk about the way in which that perspective can be applied to punishment. So let's see. Imagine you know what makes the world a good place. People who did this, utilitarians, spoke about pleasure or happiness or different grades of pleasure if you're middle or something like that. Happiness is certainly good. The world is better when people are happy than when they're not happy. Pleasure, they think, also is good. People experiencing pleasure are better than people who are experiencing pain, and even than people who aren't experiencing pleasure. Other things being equal, and you can give somebody a pleasure, that's the right thing to do. So their attitude is, as I said before, you have a decision, let's say, between A and B. Ask, what will A's consequences be in terms of happiness, pleasure, and pain? What will B's consequences be in terms of happiness, pleasure, and pain? Sum them up, which is certainly non-trivial, how you sum them up. And if you can sum them up and give them a score, whichever one has the higher score, that's what you should do, full stop. That's the end of the considerations. Well, first of all, there are counterexamples of several different types to this type of thinking. Here's one. Let's suppose you think that pleasure and happiness are what make the world a good place. I want you to imagine 10 people who are on a small island somewhere in the Pacific, and they're there, and they're going to live there, and they're going to die there, and no one is ever going to discover them. So what they do has effects only on themselves, and nothing else. There's nothing else to consider. And let's imagine that 9 of them would get considerable pleasure out of torturing the 10th. So much pleasure that when you weigh up the pleasure of the 9 versus the pain of the 10th, it's definitely worth doing. If you compare not torturing him with torturing him, not torturing him leaves the situation as it is. Torturing him creates lots of pleasure for 9 and pain for the 10th. The sum total of pleasure and pain there is very positive. It's definitely worth doing versus not doing. According to utilitarianism, I'm glad you're all sitting down, not only are you permitted to torture the 10th, you're obligated to torture the 10th. If you decide not to torture the 10th, you're evil because you didn't act in such a way as to make the world as good a place as it could be, to improve the world and make it better as much as you can. You didn't do that. So you're evil. You're a criminal for not torturing him. Does that sound right? I don't think it sounds right. I think it sounds desperately wrong. If that's what consequentialism or utilitarianism says you should do, that's a big strike against it. That's one thing. Then there's another thing. Do all pleasures count equally? Do we just calculate how many pleasures there are and how strong they are and add them up? What about the pleasures of sadism? I enjoy when people suffer. That's why I like to make them suffer. Okay, all right, let's see, let's compare it. How much pain are you causing him and how much pleasure are you getting? And then calculate and put it in the bag. I think thoughtful people, when they meditate on this, come to the conclusion that the pleasure of a sadist doesn't count. It shouldn't be put into the calculation. It's not another thing that makes the world good, because it's a vicious pleasure. It's an evil pleasure. Not all pleasures count. If not all pleasures count, then you can't simply just add up the pleasures, and you have to make a moral judgment about which pleasures count, which pleasures don't count, and that moral judgment isn't a utilitarian judgment. It's coming from someplace else. So that's the second problem. And there are other problems as well. So maybe it isn't obvious that the only thing to do in morality is calculate consequences. Then there's the famous trolley problem. Do you all know the trolley problem? No? Okay, this has become an industry, very, very instructive industry. I'm going to strip it down to its bare essentials, but there are 400-page books written on this subject. I think Philippa Foot was the first one to introduce this type of problem. Let's imagine a trolley that's bearing down a track, and let's say a mile down the track, there are 5 people who are tied to the track. And if the trolley keeps going, it's going to run over all 5 and kill them. That's bad. Now, there is a splice in the track, half a mile down the track. And if the trolley turns off onto the splice, it'll miss the 5. But there's one person tied on that track, and they'll kill him. And the brakes will give him away. So you can't stop the trolley. Now, you are a trolley operator. You're sitting at the side. You have the switch, which enables you to switch the track to go onto the splice. Do you push the button or don't you push the button? On the one hand, it's 5 against 1. On the other hand, the guy on the splice is not now in danger. He's not in danger. So, have you any right to endanger him to save the others? Most people think that you should push the button. After all, the 5 are innocent also. It's just that the trolley where it is now is putting them in danger, not putting the other guy in danger. You're switching the danger. Instead of 5 people being killed, 1 person being killed. Even though there are people who disagree here, and they have something to say, I'm not going to work with that now. Let's take the majority, considerable majority, who say, yes, you should push the button and have it go on to the splice, and that way kill only 1 instead of 5. Now, the same scenario with a slight difference. 5 people are tied down, the trolley's heading towards them, the brakes have lost, they can't stop the trolley, and there's a bridge over the track. And there's a big, heavy guy on that bridge. And you can press a button which will toss him onto the track in front of the train, so that the train will hit him and kill him, instead of killing the other 5. You press the button? Many, many people who would push the button in the first place will not push the button in the second case. The question is, why not? Why not? Here's an intuition, a leading intuition, to explain it. In both cases, it's 1 versus 5. In both cases, the one who if you switch it from the 5 to the 1, he wasn't in danger, and he's now in danger, he's going to be killed. But in the first case, the trolley's aimed at 5. The guy on the side pushes the button to go onto the splice. That is an act of saving the 5. That's all it is. I'll prove it to you. If there was nobody on the splice, he would certainly do it, wouldn't he? If there was nobody on the splice, there'd be no discussion. Of course he should push. He's saving 5 lives. Pushing the button in the first case is saving the 5. Now it's true. The 1 on the splice is going to be killed. That's true. That's a consequence of saving the 5. And the other thought is, well, actions have consequences. Sometimes there are sacrifices that are made. In this case, since it's 1 and 5, imagine the person on the 1, right? If he were sitting with the button, he also would push the button. He understands that 1 and 5 is different. It's unfortunate for him that he's there, but it's a consequence of an act where the action's purpose is saving and only saving. The action's effect is saving. It's just a consequence that the other person dies. When you have the bridge over the track, you are making the person on the bridge into the implement that stops the train. That means you're using him to stop the train. Your action isn't an action of saving. Your action is an action of killing. You're killing the one. It has the consequence of saving the five. It's the opposite now. The question is, what are you doing and what are the consequences? And there's a reverse here. And people say, morally, there's a big difference between saving with a consequence of death versus killing with a consequence of saving life. They're not the same. Because your action in the one case is an action of saving, and the action in the other case is an action of killing. I'll give you a parallel example without trolleys. This kind of thing happens in real life. Let's say there are victims in a hospital or sick people in a hospital. One scenario is 5 people are dying, they need transplants. And then there's George. George is in the hospital and he has just the right organs and just the right blood type match for all 5. And if I kill George and take his organs, I can save 5 people. Most people will say you can't do that. You cannot kill a person to save other people. You can't, not even when you're killing 1 and saving 5, you can't do that. But let's suppose there are 6 people who need help. And there are doctors there, and given their resources, they have 2 choices. They can work on the 5 and save the 5 and the 6th will die, or they can work on the 1 and save him and the 5 will die. Isn't that a no-brainer? Of course they should work on the 5. If they work on the 5, they're not working on the 1 and the 1 will die. That's right. That's the consequences of saving the 5. You can't work on everybody. Save the majority that you can. That's not at all like the first case where you kill somebody to take his organs to save other people. There you're killing somebody. You can't kill someone as a means to saving other people. But you can save people where, as a result of saving these, you don't save that one and that one dies. That you can do. Now, these calculations have nothing to do with utilitarianism. In every case, it's exactly 1 or 5. If you're looking at consequences, you'd have to treat all 4 cases exactly the same. Go for the 5 and ignore the 1. Wouldn't make any difference whatsoever whether you push him off the bridge or whether he's on the splice. Wouldn't make any difference at all. But it does make a difference. Morally, it makes a terrific difference. So that being the case, the idea that you just look at the consequences is not correct morally. Moral life is much more complicated than utilitarianism would make out. There are consequences that have to be considered. There are non-consequential rules for what you can and cannot do, which have to be considered, and sometimes they conflict, and life is tough and difficult and subtle and controversial and doubtful. There are 2 different ways in which things aren't settled. One is where people disagree, and another is where each person individually can't make up his mind. He has a disagreement in his head. It's not just they disagree with each other. In fact, everyone can agree that they're doubtful in their heads. And that way, the agreement doesn't settle anything because each person is unsettled in his own head. That's the general background. Now let's talk about punishment. Let's talk about the suffering of someone who's done evil. So, yes, very often that suffering has good consequences, and we're admitting that. We're taking into account the consequences. The question is, what about the suffering of someone who there'll be no consequences at all? I know somebody who's committed terrible evil, and I know that he had an accident. Only I know, because only I was there. He had an accident, and he died a very painful death. Nobody knows about it. He disappeared. He's floated to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. He's eaten by sharks, something like that. I'm not going to tell anybody. But I feel tremendous satisfaction because he deserved it. I would have felt that the world is out of kilter if he had lived his life to the end and died peacefully in his bed, I would have felt something was missing from the world. Because given the evil that he did, he deserved to suffer. And this has no consequences at all. Now, someone says, like I said at the beginning, but that's childish. That's, you want to get him back. That's just primitive and so forth and so on. Really? Let me ask you where you're coming from. You look at the world and you say, happiness is good. Pleasure is good. Where's that coming from? Shall I say you're like a little kid who likes candy, only you get different kinds of pleasure? Is this just childish to prize pleasure? Pleasure doesn't have any real value. In these sorts of discussions, what you start with is you meditate on a case, and then you form an impression of the case, you form a judgment about the case, and the judgment seems to you to be right. You take those judgments, organize them, you try to state principles that are behind them. You can't ignore when something seems right to you. Some people, like Peter Singer and other mistaken utilitarians, say utilitarianism has a rule and it has a definition, and therefore it's right, and if you feel differently, ignore your feelings, because we have a theory that's right. Sorry, your theory gets its credibility only because it seems to imply consequences that you feel are right consequences. If you didn't, it wouldn't have any authority whatsoever. And when it has consequences that feel definitely wrong, that counts against your theory. Because it's those judgments that you start with which are the data on which the theory is built. Without that, you're just shooting the breeze. You're just talking. So when you feel that he ought to suffer, it's good that he suffer. That's something which could also be one of these basic moral judgments, these basic moral feelings. Just like you feel that when somebody is good, does good, sacrifices for the good, and something good happens to him, you feel that, yeah, that's right. It's good that happened. It's wonderful that happened. Not because he'll be better or share it with somebody else. It's just that a person who lives that kind of life deserves a good outcome. It's the right ending to the story. So here too, there's this intuition that the person who's committed the crime should be punished, because otherwise the world is a worse place. The world is a worse place, not because of consequence, but because of the very thing itself. If he doesn't get punished, the world is a worse place. If he doesn't get punished, the world is a better place. Those intuitions simply can't be simply ignored. And that being the case, there's room for retributive justice as one aspect of justice. I don't know anybody who thinks that retributive justice is the only consideration, but it's a consideration in questions of what it is just, what is in terms of punishment, whether the punishment is justified or not. It's one of the considerations that can't be ignored. It's not childish. It's not primitive. It's not just tit for tat. It's the intuition that this kind of behavior needs this kind of response, and if it gets that kind of response, then something just has happened. Now, having said all of that, I want to share with you some sources which my Rebbitzin found for me. I just want to make one final sort of cautionary remark. This Rabbi Meisman has stressed to me quite a number of times. When you take concepts from general philosophy and you try to apply them to Yiddishkeit, you're in danger of misinterpreting the Torah because you're working with foreign concepts. I think that's right. He actually corrected me several times where I had made that mistake. So I don't want to say that the Torah is consequentialist, the Torah is retributivist, and it matches up in the categories. What I want to point out is that there are certain features of sources in the Torah which agree with one or another of these, more or less, that they're in the same ballpark, and therefore it isn't a simple equation. And I'm concerned in part to say so because in my first Jewish book, I wrote that the Torah is consequentialist, and I think I made a mistake. I think it was incorrect in writing that in my book, The Informed Soul. So let me share with you some halachos and the reasons for the halachos, which the Rabbi sent me this afternoon. Here we are. Let's say you find a person who's been murdered. Now, there are some differences between where the murderer is a non-Jew or is a Jew, and since we are facing a case where the murderer is a non-Jew, so that's what I'm talking about. You find a murdered person. You bury him exactly where he is. You don't put him in a cemetery. You bury him with his clothes. You don't take off his clothes and put on a tachrich, a white shroud. You don't do that. Some places have a custom to put a shroud over his clothes, but you leave his clothes on. Especially if they're blood-stained, then you definitely bury him with his clothes on. And you make sure to bury all the blood. If he shed blood, you dig around the corpse and take the dirt with you to the extent where the blood could have seeped. This is not only a question of burying dead people and all the parts of dead people. It's not only that, as you will see. You bury him in the place where he's found. Now, one of the reasons for this is that he's buried in such a way that the crime that was committed is preserved. If he were bathed in a mikveh and clean and put in a white, you wouldn't have known that he was killed. Everybody is usually bathed and then put in a white garment. No, we want it to be visible, because in that way the soul remains conscious of its end and seeks vengeance against the murderer. Some places, they bury the victim with a knife in his hand, as if to say, I'm coming after you. The verse says, when it talks about an unknown murderer, the earth will not be purified other than by the death of the murderer. And by the way, if you happen to know about the ceremony of the Egel Arufa, which is what you do when someone was killed and you don't find the murderer, you perform that ceremony. If you find the murderer, you execute him. Indeed, the Rambam writes, the purpose of the whole ceremony, which is very elaborate and very unique, will attract a lot of attention. The purpose of it is to get people talking about the murder, so if any information exists so you can catch the murderer, you'll find it and you'll catch him. So it doesn't excuse the murderer. No. The murder victim does not rest. That means his soul does not rest till the murderer is killed. Which means, if you have pity on the soul of the victim, his soul can't find rest until the murderer is found and punished. The soul of the victim demands justice and that his murderer be put to death, and does not rest until until this is done. Now, of course, until this is done, if a Kadosh Baruch Hu arranges that he should die, so that's good enough. Also, and there may be other ways. The general rule, in other words, this is something which every rule has exceptions. Every rule can be overridden by other rules. But the rule here is that in general, a murder victim is someone for whom the death of the murderer is a comfort. There's a story in the Midrash that someone murdered his brother. And his mother saved the blood in a jar, that is to say, the blood of the one who died, and that blood boiled until the murderer sibling was killed. So you see that there's something in the world that Kadosh Baruch Hu created that demands justice. It doesn't say anything here about preventing other murders or about certainly not rehabilitating him, because it doesn't say anything here about protecting from other, protecting against his further murders, or other people committing murder. No, just that the blood of the deceased person boils until the murderer is killed.
Zachariah too.
Yes, with Zachariah. There it was in the temple, and it was a compound crime, but it was certainly that was part of it. We say when someone has been murdered, when we mention his name, we say Hashem yikom damo. Hashem should avenge his blood. The sources say that brings satisfaction to the soul. It means people remember the crime, and they are wishing that Hashem should work vengeance on the person. That brings satisfaction to the soul. Now, that means that these sources at least indicate that there is an idea that vengeance is a positive event. It's the source of this is much deeper than that. The Creator is described as Nokem. Nokem means something like vengeance, although we have to qualify it quite carefully. The Gemara points out that there's a verse in which the word Nokem, which means something like revenge, is placed between two names of God, Keil Nekamas Hashem. Now, we have to understand what vengeance means, what revenge means in human terms, and what it means in divine terms. And then, as we'll see, we are supposed to learn from what it means in divine terms how we should go about it. That's as I learned from an essay by Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz, is one of the bracha. So let's see. The Rambam writes that God revealed to Moses his 13 attributes. Whether they're mercy or not is an open question, but there are 13 attributes. And he says that since Moses at that time already possessed complete encyclopedic knowledge of the way God runs the world, why did he need those 13? And he says, the end of the verse, which is, Moses says to God, "For this is your people," is the answer. Moses functioned as the king of the Jewish people. And he said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, "I know how you run the world, but I want to know which of your characteristics should I use in being king over a people, in this worldly terms?" So HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed to him these 13 attributes. Now, according to the Rambam's rendering of the 13 attributes, the last one is Poked Ovan Ovos Al Banim V'Al Bnei Banim V'Al Shishem Rebeim. He applies the sins of the parents to the children and down to the fourth generation. That certainly doesn't sound like mercy, and the Rambam says it isn't. He says the instruction that Moses got was 12 attributes of mercy and one of punishment. So he said, first thing that Moses learned was the vast majority of your interaction with the people is one of kindness and mercy. 12 out of 13. Now he says, and this, by the way, in part 1, chapter 54 of the guide. He says, what about the 13th? People, when they punish evildoers, often have a personal animus. I hate him. He destroyed something that's precious to me. He frustrated my life. He caused me pain and so forth and so on. I'm getting him back and all of the rest of that. He says that's utterly foreign from the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Even righteous indignation, which is, of course, the most pleasant of all possible experiences, just ask the people in one political faction in the United States, the joy at destroying your enemy, shouldn't rejoice in the death of your enemy, that's very hard to remove from the vengeance. Even if the revenge, if there's something that was objectively wrong, but it wasn't only objectively wrong, it also interacted with the person who's taking the revenge in a certain personal way. That's not true of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't have any feelings, doesn't have any emotions. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's exacting of Nekama is because that's what's necessary. That's what's necessary. And so as a human being, we are different from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have psychological motivations. And when it comes to acting out what Hakadosh Baruch Hu wants done in the world, we should be as little moved by those psychological motivations as possible. God has no psychological motivations. When we talk about God's midos, so to speak, his character traits, they're not character traits at all. They are categories of action. They're descriptions of certain types of action. Roughly, it works like this. When we say God is merciful, what we mean is God does the kind of thing which merciful people do. A person's mercy is a part of his character. Mercy is part of his psychology, which motivates what he does. When we call God merciful, we say, well, a person has mercy as a character trait. That character trait leads him to do various things. Cut out the character trait, look at the things that are done. Those are the kinds of things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does. For HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's only the actions, not the psychology behind it. So he says, the Rambam says, what God told Moses is, look, you're a human being, and therefore you have a psychology, you have character traits, and they do motivate you. But when it comes to acting out my principles in the world, try to minimize that as much as possible. Try to do it as much as possible the way I do it, because of the objective necessity of it. He points out, for example, when we are told to wipe out the idol worshippers in the land of Israel, the Torah gives a reason. The reason is so they shouldn't teach you the things they did and corrupt you. Doesn't say they abandoned me. They took other gods than I am. They spit in my face. Get them for me. Destroy them for me. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because of an objective reason. Objective reasons they're going to mislead you. So you should do it with as little emotion as possible. Okay, now let's apply that. This is how I got into this a long time ago. I haven't studied Nach the way I should, but in one of the Haftorahs you have King David's death. He gives instructions to Solomon, his son, what he should do. The last thing that King David says to Solomon is, and don't forget, I think it was Shimon ben Gera or somebody else, he says, don't forget to kill him. Don't let him go peacefully down to the grave. Kill him. Whew. And then he dies. And I thought, wow, what a way for King David to leave the world. The last thing is, don't forget to kill so-and-so. Like, I would have imagined something, more august and more noble. And so Chaim Shmulevitz asks this question. And he says, Nekama is something which needs to be done. It's something that's valuable and needs to be done. But it has to be done in as godlike a way as possible, with as little emotion as possible. And this person, whom King David said to King Solomon to kill, was an enemy of King David who hurt him in various ways. King David said, I don't want to take satisfaction in anticipating his punishment. So I'll save it for the last seconds of my life. So I'll have the minimum possible satisfaction. I won't see it. I won't know that it's done. I'll give the instruction, and then I'll leave the world. This was to make it as pure as possible. So, part of desiring revenge is the struggle to make it as pure as possible. And part of the purity is this. I mentioned the idea before, but I'll now tell you the verses on which it's based. There's one verse that says, "Bin polevech al tismach," when your enemy falls, don't rejoice. Maybe I'll come back to finish the verse. The other one is, "Ba'avod v'shoim rina," when the wicked are destroyed, there is joy. Oh, well then there's a difference between the wicked on the one hand and my enemy on the other hand. Here you see the difference. My enemy, my personal animus against him, my anger, that's not appropriate. Even if he's wicked, it's not appropriate, because that's not his objective wickedness. That's how he impacted on me. But if the joy that I feel is due to the fact that he's a rasha, that he's wicked, that's good. That's appropriate. So now you have to work to subtract your personal feelings about it, because he was your enemy, not just wicked, but also your enemy, to work as much as possible to reduce that aspect of it, because that in itself is something which we're told to do. And although the verse is not usually completed, it's very important to know at the end of the verses. I don't remember exactly in the Hebrew. There's a case in the Gemara where Rava was sick. So it says on the first day he kept it secret, but the second day he said to his servant, go out to the shuk, to the marketplace, and announce that Rava is sick. Why should you do that? I'll tell you why. Because people who love me will pray for me. And I'll have their merit to help save me. And people who hate me will be happy. And that's good also. Because the verse goes on, don't rejoice when your enemy falls, lest God see and take his anger away from your enemy and apply it to you. That's why you shouldn't be happy when you see your enemy fall. So, if it's announced that I'm sick and I have enemies and they rejoice when they hear that I'm sick, that's good for me and bad for them. Because God's anger will be taken away from me, according to the verse, and it will be applied to them. So I announced it in general. It's wonderful for me that my friends hear it, and it's wonderful for me that my enemies hear it. So now I think you can hear Chaim Shmulevitz acting out or describing to us how King David acted out that particular element. He's not going after him because he's his enemy. He's minimizing that as much as possible. He could possibly rejoice if at the destruction of the wicked, but if connected to the rejoicing of the destruction of the wicked is also going to be rejoicing over the falling of his enemy, then he's going to be in trouble. That has to be minimized as much as possible. So, and when we're living in the time, the atrocities that took place on Shabbos, Sunday, I think we have to work very hard with our feelings that we shouldn't just respond viscerally to the evil, to the fact that Jews were killed and we know them and we know what they wanted and they were victimized and so forth and so on, but rather to what we would call the Chilul Hashem, the desecration of God's name in what happened, and try to see it in those kinds of objective terms. Now, I want to make one more remark, and then if you have questions, I'll take them. All of this, what I'm talking about tonight, is because it naturally associates in your mind, and in a case like this, whether vengeance is appropriate. But really, this is shadowboxing, because everyone agrees, without any disagreement whatsoever, that whatever you have to do to protect yourself, you should do. And that includes killing anybody who threatens you. So, in this case, we have decades of bitter, vicious history with Hamas. And destroying them in the most thorough possible way is the only way that we can guarantee that in the future we're not going to have more victimization. Not to this extent, but to any extent. The suicide bombers that they used to send and all the rest. There's no question that this is justified, just in a question of self-defense. And for those who have heard a rumor about proportionality in responding to attack, which is part of international law, let me inform you of something which so many people don't know, and yes, you can Google it and look it up. Proportionality does not mean that if they shoot you with bows and arrows, you should use only bows and arrows to respond. That's not what it means. If the only way you can stop a person who's shooting at you with bows and arrows is by using a hand grenade, you're perfectly permitted to use the hand grenade. Proportionality means don't use more force than is necessary to stop him. Doesn't mean you have to suffer with bows and arrows because he'll continue shooting bows and arrows at you. You don't have to suffer that. You don't have to suffer any victimization at all. And the only way to stop a person with rifles with an atomic bomb, but according to proportionality, you can throw an atomic bomb at him. So you talk about that we have planes, that they don't have planes, and so forth and so on. We saw what they did, the things that they did with utter brutish evil, animalistic evil. Like the Rambam says, certain people who have no morals are like animals, but they're worse because they're intelligent enough to do more damage than animals do. And that's certainly what they demonstrated over the weekend. So whatever is done to destroy their capabilities is definitely worth it. And if somebody is shooting at you, and the only way you can save yourself is by shooting back and you hit other people, you have a right to protect yourself. So it's not, you don't need a justification of revenge in order to justify what's going on in Gaza now. That's straightforwardly appropriate. Questions?
Just one, really, let's say Plony does evil to me, he punches me. Okay, so it's my understanding there are 4 levels. The Torah says, do not take revenge, that's one level. Do not hate your neighbor in your heart, that's another level. Then there's forgiveness, both slicha and mechila. One is complete forgiveness, one is I don't want Hashem to punish him, and then there's love your neighbor as yourself. Where I want to punch him back, but I know I can't do revenge, but I'm still going to hate him in my heart. Maybe I'm not explaining it.
Let me just you've left out something.
Okay.
There's the Kriya Shema Lamita we say every night, right?
I forgive everyone.
Well,
that's more of a slicha.
Well, no, it's not a slicha. It's a phrase of forgiven. It's forgiving everything. But I don't know if you have which text you have. But according to the more complete text, there's a little parenthesis. I forgive them and I don't hold a grudge against them or anything else. But if they owe me money in court.
Right. And I'll speak for them.
Oh, but that's very important.
It's money, though.
No, it isn't. It's not just money. It's their punishment. And it's a crime against them to relieve them of their punishment. They need that punishment. That punishment is good for them. It's not only that I get the money. The punishment is good for them. They are in a better condition when they're punished for what they did wrong than when they are not punished for what they did wrong. So of course you don't want to forgive that. I don't hold a grudge against them in my heart, but the Torah says they should be punished for what they did. So I take them to court, and I prosecute them, and I get the punishment. I'll take the money also because that's what the Torah said to do. The Torah said if you injure somebody, if you hurt him or cause them embarrassment, there's 5 different things you pay for when a person suffers an injury, right? The pain itself is something that you get paid for. So there's no reason whatsoever. That being the case, he should get hit, just not by you. Not by you. Should go through a court procedure. There's a big difference because you see, if you hit him, you're just paying him back, or maybe just paying him back. If the court hits him, then it's a legal procedure where divine guidance guides it. We know that God wants him to have it, and wants him to have it in this form and at this time, and then he's getting what he needs. So, and again, to take satisfaction. So then again, there you should say, you wouldn't take satisfaction. Got him back. That's been al. But you can say he committed a crime, and the appropriate response to the crime took place, and I'm happy that Kodesh Baruch Hu's justice was done in the world. That's perfectly appropriate.
Okay, so the way this is probably wrong, but the way I approach Kriya Shema Lamita is, or at least the forgiveness part is, I know I've probably hurt others in my life, and I sure hope I get forgiveness, so I'll be magnanimous.
That's good.
And forgive others, and maybe the balance is out at the end of the day.
That's good. The Gemara talks about that. Kodesh Baruch Hu deals with people mida keneged mida, and if you show,
I don't forgive him. I just don't want God to punish him. Yeah, I mean,
Well, but then you're not getting the benefit. The benefit is coming from forgiving him. That's mida keneged mida, right? You want the Kodesh Baruch Hu to. Kodesh Baruch Hu, if he doesn't forgive you, he's not going to give up on the thing.
So then, what's the difference between slicha and mechila?
Mechila is a this is the explanation I got in the name of the Gemara. The mechila is a question of a monetary debt. Mechila in monetary law is releasing a person from a monetary debt. Slicha means I'm not angry. I'm not angry. I forgive, right? But there's another way to do it. You what you said is right, but there's another way to do it. I don't know what's going on at home. I don't know what pressures he's under. I saw this with my own eyes. I couldn't believe it. I was in Boston with my Rabbi, and diving, like I said, every morning. And after Shachris, somebody came in and started yelling at the Rabbi, face to face, yelling at him. I was, I wanted to kill the guy, actually. I was in terrible distress. And the Rebbe didn't look particularly bothered by it, but I was in terrible distress. And finally, I got in between them. I pushed myself in between them, facing the guy, and I forced him out the door. So I came back to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe looked reasonably calm. I said, Rebbe, how do you do that, If he'd been yelling at me like that, he'd be on the floor, in blood. and aside, he said, I know what's going on at home. I thought, wait a minute. If he's really under pressure at home, so he's not himself, as we say. He's not acting because he decided to act this way. Not deep-seated, it's provoked by some extreme situation that he has at home. So, Rabbi Nachman encourages people to say, I don't know what's going on at home, but maybe there's something terrible going on at home. And if there is, then maybe I should dan l'chafschus that he's under terrible pressure. And that's why he's doing what he did. He still deserves to be punished in Beis Din. You're not allowed to use your problems at home as an excuse to go around beating up other people. You can't do that. But I won't hate him as much if I think that he's under terrible pressure and he didn't succeed in overcoming the pressure. I certainly won't hate him as much. So that's one way to relieve, to expunge your own hatred by giving him the benefit of the doubt that he's under terrible pressure. Anyway, that's the background for revenge. You have a question?
Is it kosher to, if a person doesn't have enough, is not able to kind of remove himself from the picture and just try to go about administering revenge in a sort of like a din only perspective? Is he allowed to rile himself up with kind of some emotion?
I'm not quite getting it. If someone has injured you in some way and you can't get him prosecuted, is that what you're saying? And therefore you still want revenge and you want to rile yourself up? Well, I don't quite get it.
About administering eventually, Dovid told the person to administer the revenge.
Right.
Now let's say the person's in a situation where he's put in a situation where he has to administer revenge.
Oh, where he has to administer the revenge. Well, I suppose what Chaim Shmulevitz said, and the others also said, should apply there as well. What the Rambam said in 154, that when you administer punishment to the population, you as king, you should do it because of the objectivity of it, and not because you're riled up, to the extent to which you can prevent yourself from becoming riled up. That's why he gave the example. Kadosh Baruch Hu is described as being angry at idol worship, whatever that means, because it's not really emotion. But when he tells us to eliminate the idol worshippers from the land of Israel, after offering them peace, and if they offer peace, we don't kill anybody. That's what people are ignorant. Chapter 6 in the Laws of Kings of the Rambam. We should try to do that with as little emotion as possible. So it doesn't sound like you're supposed to. It sounds like you're not supposed to rile yourself up to administer the punishment.
You can't willingly inject emotion into the picture.
Well, maybe I'm understanding your question. If you can't administer the punishment or the revenge without riling yourself up, is that the question? If it's unnecessary, then I don't know. The only way you can do it, I guess, by the words I quoted from the Rambam, you might have an implication like that. Because the Rambam is quite careful. I mean, I'm reading it in the Hebrew, obviously. I hope the Arabic is similar. He's quite careful to say as little as possible. Every time he says it, he says as little as possible, which means he's aware that we can't conquer all of our emotions. And he doesn't give a limit, say, well, if you can bring it down to 10, then do it. But if it's going to stay at 20, don't do it. He doesn't say that. He just says as little as possible. Now, you're talking about the opposite, riling yourself to get you to do it because you have to do it. Sounds to me like he would allow that. I'm going out on a limb, but it sounds to me like he would allow that. Because he says that you're doing it when it's objectively necessary. You should do it with as little emotion as possible. If it's objectively necessary, you have to do it. If you can't do it without emotion, probably you should work on the emotion so as to be able to do it. That sounds reasonable.
What about davening angry? Some of the best advice the Rav gave me was while davening, don't put God in a box. But I've got some serious requests from Hashem to do to some of these people really bad things. And just been holding it in.
I think you should go back to your first thought.
Don't put God in a box.
And not only that, but what you said before, 7 minutes ago, that Kadosh Baruch Hu judges us mida keneged mida.
But these are terrorists. These are vile.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, there we do have. Look at the. There is that one bracha, which talks about what Kadosh Baruch Hu should do to these people. But if you read it carefully, you'll see that it does not ask for death.
okay.
Read carefully, you see it doesn't ask for, but that they should be helpless and powerless and subjugated and all the rest of that. That's all there. That's all there. That you can daven for with a full heart. Just say those words meaningfully. Yes, absolutely.